Take it off, Commander. Those were the first words Judge Harold Vance said to me that morning, before he'd asked me a single question, before I'd sworn to tell the truth, before anything. I was standing at the witness stand in my dress blues, 14 years of service pinned to my chest in 5 neat rows of ribbon, and right at the top, above everything else, sat the pale blue ribbon with the 5 white stars that most people in that courtroom had never seen up close in their lives. The Navy Cross, second highest decoration this country gives out. I'd earned it pulling 2 men out of a burning compartment on a ship I'm still not allowed to name in full, and I don't say that to brag. I say it because I want you to understand exactly what Judge Vance was asking me to take off, and exactly how calmly he asked it, like he was asking me to remove a hat. Your Honor, my attorney started to say, half rising out of her chair. It's a distraction to the proceedings, counsel. This is a custody hearing, not a 4th of July parade. He didn't even look at her when he said it. He looked at me. Behind me, I heard a phone buzz once, sharp and close, from the direction of the court clerk's desk. She glanced down at it, frowned, and turned it face down without answering. I didn't know yet whose number had just lit up her screen. I would, before the day was over, and it would matter more than anything Judge Vance said from that bench. I reached up and unpinned the ribbon. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm a commander in the United States Navy, and at the time all of this happened, I'd spent 14 years in service. The last 3 of them stationed out of Naval Base San Diego, training junior officers on damage control and leading a division that, on paper, ran like a machine, because I made sure it did. I was good at my job. I was good at a lot of things. I was not, according to the woman I used to be married to, good at being a husband, and after 11 years together, she filed for divorce 9 months before I ever stood in front of Judge Vance. I want to be fair here, because fair is something I've always tried to be, even when it costs me. Rachel and I had real problems before any lawyer got involved. 3 deployments in 6 years wears on a marriage in ways that are hard to explain to people who haven't lived it. I missed birthdays. I missed the day our daughter, Lily, lost her first tooth, and missed the day she learned to ride a bike. And I have made my peace with the fact that some of what broke between Rachel and me broke because of choices I made. Choices the uniform asked of me, and I said yes to. I'm not the villain of this story because I was a perfect husband. I wasn't. But I never once, not one single time, gave Rachel or anyone else a real reason to believe I was a danger to my own daughter. That part matters, because that's exactly what was about to be argued in front of Judge Vance. Rachel had gotten engaged 4 months after our divorce was finalized, to a man named Marcus Dunmore, who ran an investment firm out of a glass office downtown and wore a watch that probably cost more than my truck. I'd met him twice. Both times he shook my hand a little too hard and called me Commander, in a tone that made the rank sound like a costume. I didn't think much of him beyond finding him irritating. I had no idea, walking into that custody hearing, how much of what was about to happen to me had his fingerprints on it. The morning of the hearing, I got a text from my attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense JAG officer named Lieutenant Commander Grace Whitfield, who I'd known since a legal assistance clinic on base years earlier, and who'd agreed to represent me off-duty as a personal favor, because family court wasn't technically her lane, but she said she wasn't about to let some civilian firm fumble a case with a Navy Cross recipient's daughter on the line. Her text said, "You sure you want to wear the ribbon today? Might not matter, but it might matter more than we think." I wrote back, "I earned it. I'm not hiding it in a closet because it makes someone uncomfortable." She sent back a single word, "Understood." I believed, walking into that courtroom that morning, that the worst thing that could happen to me was losing time with my daughter over a judge who didn't like the optics of medals in his courtroom. I had no idea I was about to learn that Judge Vance's objection to that ribbon had almost nothing to do with courtroom decorum, and everything to do with making sure nobody in that room looked too closely at him. So I unpinned it. I set it down on the small wooden ledge of the witness stand, face up, where the whole courtroom could still see the 5 white stars even without it on my chest, and I looked back at Judge Vance and said, "Ask your questions, Your Honor." And that's when it started, in full. The first reveal came 20 minutes later, when Rachel's attorney, a smooth, unhurried man named Foster, stood up and introduced what he called a professional evaluation of Commander Cole's psychological fitness to co-parent. I hadn't been evaluated by anyone. I said so, plainly, into the record. Foster smiled the specific smile of a man who already knows he's going to win the exchange and told the court that the evaluation had been conducted by a licensed family psychologist based on extensive interviews with individuals close to the commander, not on an actual session with me. I sat there in a witness stand, my ribbon still sitting on a ledge in front of me, and listened to a stranger's written opinion describe me as exhibiting hypervigilance consistent with unresolved combat trauma and a pattern of emotional withdrawal that poses developmental risk to the minor child. Not one word of it had come from talking to me. Every word of it had come from Rachel and from Marcus Dunmore, who the report noted had observed the commander's behavior during supervised handoffs. Handoffs where, as far as I could remember, I had said little more than good morning and goodbye because Marcus had never once given me a reason to want to linger. Grace stood and asked the obvious question. Who had paid for this evaluation? Foster hesitated for exactly 1 second too long before saying the fee had been covered by the petitioner's household. I did the math out loud in my head before anyone else in that courtroom did. Marcus Dunmore's household. Marcus Dunmore had paid a stranger to build a case that I was psychologically unfit to raise my own daughter, based entirely on secondhand stories fed to that stranger by the two people who benefited most if that case succeeded. Foster pressed further, reading select lines from the report aloud, his voice rising with practiced concern each time he hit a phrase like emotional unavailability or risk indicators consistent with untreated trauma exposure. I watched two jurors. This hearing didn't have a jury, only the judge, but the gallery was half full of people who worked in that courthouse and knew exactly how these things were supposed to look, and I could feel their attention shifting the way public opinion shifts when someone reads a diagnosis out loud, whether or not the diagnosis is true. I remember looking at Rachel across the courtroom. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, twisting the ring on her finger the way she always did when she knew she was somewhere she shouldn't be. And I understood, watching her, that whatever she believed about me in that moment, she hadn't gotten there on her own. Judge Vance admitted the evaluation into evidence over Grace's objection.
"I'll weigh it appropriately,"
he said, which is the kind of sentence judges say right before they don't. That was reveal number one. It would not be the last. 2 days later, during a scheduled recess before the hearing resumed, Grace called me into a small conference room at the courthouse and set a folder down on the table between us, the way she always did when she had something she needed me to hear calmly instead of reacting to. "I pulled the county's public campaign finance filings last night," she said. "Judge Vance ran for re-election 2 years ago. Guess who one of his top 5 donors was?" I already knew before she turned the folder around. Marcus Dunmore's investment firm had contributed the maximum individual amount to Vance's re-election campaign, and so had 2 shell entities that traced back through filings Grace had spent half the night untangling to the same firm. Dunmore Capital Partners, Meridian Advisory Holdings, and something called Coastline Strategic Group, all 3 registered within 4 months of each other, all 3 sharing a single registered agent's address that turned out to be a UPS store 2 blocks from Marcus's office. "That's not proof of anything by itself," Grace said, level as always. "Judges take donations from half the business community in this county. Lawyers do too, and I'm not exactly running for office on my restraint. But combined with an unusual ruling to admit an evaluation this thin, based on hearsay from the people benefiting most from it being believed, it's a pattern worth watching. I want you to stay calm in that courtroom, no matter what he says to you. Calm is your best evidence right now. Anger is what they want from you. It's literally what the evaluation predicts you'll show. So every time you don't show it, you're disproving their entire case just by sitting still." So I just sit there and take it. You sit there, you answer every question directly, you never raise your voice, you never let Foster bait you into sounding defensive, and you let me do the digging you can't do from the witness stand. She closed the folder and looked at me for a long moment. "You've spent your whole career staying steady under fire, Commander. This is the same fight, just slower. And with worse coffee. I almost laughed, despite everything. It was the first time in 2 weeks anyone had said anything that felt like it belonged to my actual life, instead of the version of it being constructed in that courtroom. I went back to base that afternoon and ran a routine damage control drill with my division, because life doesn't stop for a custody hearing, and because I needed, more than almost anything, 45 minutes where the only thing that mattered was whether my sailors could simulate sealing a flooded compartment in under regulation time. There's a particular kind of peace in a task with clear right and wrong answers. Nobody in that drill was lying to me. Nobody in that compartment cared whose donation built whose campaign. I stood at the back of the space, arms folded, stopwatch in hand, watching a 19-year-old petty officer 3rd class execute the procedure exactly the way she'd been trained, calling out timing checkpoints in a voice that never wavered, even when the simulated flooding rate doubled halfway through. For 45 minutes, I wasn't a man being quietly dismantled in family court. I was just an officer doing his job, watching someone else do theirs well. I went home that night and didn't sleep more than 3 hours, because the moment the drill ended, everything came back. The next reveal came from a place I never expected, my former mother-in-law. Rachel's mother, Joan Ashford, had always been kind to me, in a distant, careful way, the kind of kindness that comes from a woman who'd learned early in her own marriage not to ask too many questions. She always wore her reading glasses on a thin gold chain around her neck, even when she wasn't reading anything, a habit I'd noticed the very first Thanksgiving Rachel brought me home to meet her family. She called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice tight, and asked if it was true that I had walked out on Rachel and Lily during my last deployment, leaving them, in her words, to fend for themselves for months without so much as a phone call. I sat very still on my back porch, phone against my ear, watching the last of the evening light go orange over the fence line, and asked her where she'd heard that. Rachel told me, she said. She said you barely called the whole time, that Lily cried herself to sleep some nights asking where you were. I had records, actual military records, of every scheduled call I'd made during that deployment, restricted as they were by operational security, 16 calls over 5 months, every single one logged through the base family readiness system, because that's simply how deployments work when a parent is trying to stay connected under real constraints. I remembered several of those calls specifically, remembered Lily's voice going quiet and careful over a bad satellite connection, remembered promising her I'd be home for her birthday, and keeping that promise by 11 days, which had felt, at the time, like the best I could do and not nearly good enough all at once. I hadn't walked out on anyone. I had been where the Navy sent me, calling home exactly as often as regulations and satellite windows allowed, and somewhere between that deployment and this custody hearing, that truth had been rewritten into something almost unrecognizable. Joan, I said carefully, I have the call logs. The base family readiness office keeps records of every scheduled call for exactly this reason. I can show them to you tonight if you want to drive over. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. Why would Rachel tell me that if it wasn't true? She finally asked, and I could hear, underneath the question, a woman trying to hold 2 incompatible pictures of her daughter in her head at the same time, and finding that they wouldn't fit. I didn't have an answer for her that night. I would, eventually. It just wasn't the answer either of us wanted yet, and I hung up the phone feeling something I hadn't expected to feel in the middle of all of it. Sadness, not for myself, but for a woman who was slowly realizing she might not know her own daughter as well as she thought she did. 3 days after that call, Grace found something that made even her, a woman who did not rattle easily, go quiet for a full 10 seconds before she spoke. There's a prior custody case, she said, sliding a printout across the table, her leather folio open beside it, dense with color-coded tabs she'd clearly been building for days. 2 years ago, different judge, no, wait, same judge. Judge Vance, different family, similar pattern. Wealthy petitioner, questionable psych evaluation, quick unfavorable ruling against a working-class respondent who couldn't afford to fight it the way you can. She tapped the page. I don't know yet if it's a coincidence. I know it's not a coincidence I like. I remember sitting back in my chair, feeling something colder than anger settle into my chest. If Grace was right, this wasn't the first time Judge Vance had done something like this. It meant somewhere out there was another parent who'd lost time with their child the same way I was about to, and nobody had ever caught it. And that parent had simply gone on living with a version of their life that had been decided for them by a system they'd trusted to be fair. "What do we do with that?" I asked. "Carefully," Grace said. "If I file a recusal motion based on a pattern I can't fully prove yet, Vance will bury it, and he'll make the rest of this hearing worse for you out of spite. Judges have more discretion than most people realize, and a wounded one with something to hide is dangerous, not harmless. I need one more piece before I move, something undeniable. Something that isn't just a pattern on paper, but a direct line connecting him to Dunmore in a way no reasonable person could call coincidence." I didn't know it yet, but the piece she needed was sitting in a desk drawer 3 floors above us, in the possession of a court clerk who had been quietly watching Judge Vance for longer than either of us realized. The final hearing date before the ruling was set for a Thursday. The night before, I sat at my kitchen table with Lily's drawing taped to the fridge behind me. A crayon picture of a gray ship with a tiny stick figure on the deck she'd labeled, "Daddy," in careful backward capital letters. And I thought about the version of this story where I lost. Where a judge with donor money in his campaign account and a fabricated evaluation on his desk decided, on paper, that 14 years of honorable service and every phone call I'd logged from a deployed ship meant less than the story Marcus Dunmore had paid to have written about me. I thought about Lily growing up believing whatever version of me survived that courtroom, and I understood, sitting there in the quiet of my own kitchen at 11 at night, that this had stopped being about winning a legal argument a long time ago. It was about which story my daughter was going to grow up carrying. I didn't know yet how close that version of the story had come to being the real one, or how much closer it would get before Thursday was over. Thursday morning, I put my dress blues on again, and I pinned the Navy Cross back onto my chest, because whatever happened in that courtroom, I wasn't walking in a second time already halfway defeated. I was straightening the ribbon in the mirror when Grace called. "Get to the courthouse early," she said. "There's someone I need you to meet before we go in." Her name was Priya Nair, and she'd worked as a deputy court clerk under Judge Vance for 6 years. A quiet, watchful woman who carried a small spiral notebook everywhere she went. The kind you'd use for a grocery list, except hers was full of dates, case numbers, and initials, filled front to back in handwriting so small I had to lean in to read it. She met us in a stairwell outside the courtroom, glancing over her shoulder before she spoke. Her voice low even though the stairwell was empty. "I've kept records," she said, "because I started noticing a pattern 2 years ago I didn't like. And I didn't know who to trust with it. Judge Vance has ruled favorably for 6 different petitioners represented by attorneys with financial ties to Dunmore Capital Partners over the past 3 years. All 6 respondents were represented by public defenders or lower-cost counsel who couldn't match the other side's resources. I have the case numbers. I have text messages Judge Vance sent from his personal phone to a number registered to Marcus Dunmore, forwarded to me accidentally 8 months ago, when he meant to send a screenshot to his clerk's office email instead and hit my name in his contacts by mistake. I've been terrified to come forward. I have a mortgage and a 9-year-old, and no idea what happens to a court clerk who accuses a sitting judge of taking money to fix custody cases. But I watched you take that ribbon off 2 weeks ago, Commander, and something about it wouldn't let me sit on this anymore." She handed the notebook to Grace, along with a sealed envelope of printed message threads. Her hand steady even though I could see, in the set of her jaw, exactly how much it was costing her to hold them that way. I stood in that stairwell reading a text from Judge Vance to Marcus Dunmore that read in full, "Should go the way we discussed." We walked into that courtroom 20 minutes later, and Grace filed an emergency motion for recusal and judicial misconduct review, entering Priya's documentation into the record before Judge Vance had even finished sitting down. I watched his face change in real time, the practiced calm cracking at the edges the moment he understood exactly what Grace was holding and exactly who had handed it to her. He looked up, once, toward the back of the courtroom, and found Priya sitting in the gallery, notebook still in her lap, looking directly back at him without flinching. Your Honor, Grace said, I'd like the record to reflect that the petitioner's household directly financed a psychological evaluation subsequently endorsed by this court, following private communication between this court and the petitioner's fiancé regarding the desired clinical framing of that evaluation. I'm requesting immediate recusal and referral to the Judicial Conduct Commission. Judge Vance's gavel hand was shaking slightly when he called a recess. I don't think he'd expected anyone in that building to have the nerve, or the documentation, to actually corner him. The twist came an hour later, once the recess hearing reconvened under an emergency substitute judge brought in to review the misconduct claim. Priya, testifying, revealed something none of us had known. The family from that earlier case 2 years ago, the one Grace had flagged as a possible pattern, had lost custody of their son under nearly identical circumstances: a fabricated evaluation, a rushed unfavorable ruling, donor money connecting the winning side to Judge Vance's campaign. That father, Priya told the court, had never been able to afford an appeal. He'd lost his son and never gotten so much as a second hearing. I sat there, my Navy Cross catching the fluorescent light of that courtroom, and understood that I hadn't just been fighting for Lily that morning. I'd accidentally uncovered something that had already cost another family everything, years before I ever walked into that building. The Judicial Conduct Commission moved faster than any of us expected once Priya's documentation was in their hands. Judge Harold Vance was suspended from the bench within a week, pending investigation, and resigned 3 months later rather than face a public disciplinary hearing that his own texts had already decided the outcome of. The State Attorney General's office picked up the case not long after, and he was eventually indicted on charges connected to judicial bribery. Reporters who covered the story found, digging back through years of his rulings, at least 11 cases now under formal review, each one involving a wealthier petitioner with financial ties somewhere back to a handful of the same donors. He never once, through any of it, admitted wrongdoing or expressed regret to anyone involved, not even at his own resignation announcement, where he described his departure as a personal decision to spend more time with family, the same tired phrase men like him always seem to reach for when the truth would require something they've never once practiced saying. That's simply who he was, and I stopped expecting anything different from him the day I read that text about the way we discussed. Marcus Dunmore's firm was placed under state financial regulatory review, and separately, he was charged as a co-conspirator in the bribery case, his campaign contributions to Vance recharacterized, in the state's filing, as a pattern of payment for favorable rulings across at least 3 custody and business disputes. He hired the best defense attorneys money could buy, and he may yet avoid the worst of it. I've made my peace with the fact that people like Marcus Dunmore rarely lose as completely as the damage they cause deserves. What I know for certain is that he lost Rachel, and he lost his engagement, and he lost the quiet control he'd had over how my daughter's future was going to be decided, and that a man who built his entire identity around controlling outcomes finally found one he couldn't buy his way out of. Rachel's part in all of this was harder to sort out, and I want to be honest about that, because this isn't a story where every person who hurt me deserves the same ending. She had believed real lies about the deployment, about what Marcus told her the evaluation actually meant, about who I'd supposedly become while she wasn't paying close enough attention to check. That doesn't erase what she did. It complicates it. 2 weeks after Judge Vance's suspension, Rachel called me, and for the first time in over a year, she didn't sound like someone reciting a version of events she'd been handed. She sounded like herself, the version I'd married 11 years earlier, before deployments and lawyers and a man with an expensive watch had rewritten so much of what used to be simple between us. I should have asked you directly, she said. About the deployment, about all of it. I let myself believe the version that made this easier, because the truth meant admitting I'd let Marcus tell me who you were instead of remembering who you actually are. She was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her breathing unevenly on the other end, the way she always did right before she said something she'd been rehearsing. I'm not asking you to forgive me today. I'm asking if we can try to co-parent, like 2 people who both actually love our daughter, instead of like 2 sides of a case file. I told her I needed time, and she said that was fair, and over the following months, time did what it usually does when both people are actually trying. We settled joint custody outside of court, without lawyers standing between every conversation. sitting across from each other at the same kitchen table where Lily used to do her homework, working out a schedule neither of us loved completely, but both of us could actually live with. It isn't perfect. It's honest. And after everything, honest was more than I'd let myself hope for. Joan Ashford, my former mother-in-law, showed up at my door not long after that with a container of the lemon bars she used to make every Christmas and stood on my porch turning her reading glasses over in her hands before she managed to say simply, "I'm sorry I believed it. I should have called you the day I heard it instead of the day I finally did." I let her in. We sat at my kitchen table with the lemon bars between us, not saying much at first, and eventually she told me she'd gone back through old photos from that deployment, found herself a picture from the homecoming, Lily running full speed across the pier into my arms, and realized she let a story overwrite a memory she'd actually witnessed with her own eyes. She reads Lily bedtime stories most Sunday nights now, the same as she always did before any of this started. And I've decided that a woman who was lied to and eventually chose the truth over her own comfort deserves a place at my daughter's table. Priya Nair was reassigned, at her own request, to a court integrity office the state created in the aftermath of Vance's resignation, specifically to review historical rulings for the kind of pattern she'd spotted 2 years too late to stop the first time. Grace tells me Priya's the reason 4 other families are getting their cases reopened right now, families who'd long since given up hope that anyone would ever look twice at what happened to them. I sent her a card that just said, "Thank you," because I didn't have words big enough for what she actually did, walking away from 6 years of quiet compliance to hand a stranger in a stairwell a notebook that could have cost her everything, and instead ended up giving several strangers their families back. 1 year later, I'm sitting on my porch in San Diego, off duty, watching Lily draw another ship on a driveway in sidewalk chalk, this one with 2 stick figures on deck now instead of 1, and the small dog she's been begging me for since spring standing guard beside her chalk drawing like it belongs there too. My navy cross sits in a shadow box on the wall inside, exactly where I want it, not because a courtroom finally let me wear it, but because I never needed anyone's permission to have earned it in the first place. They made me take it off once. They never got to decide what it meant. If this story meant something to you, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if you believe honor doesn't need a courtroom's approval to be real, hit subscribe because there are more stories like this one still waiting to be told.